Have fun getting overthrown. I've often looked back on that period of my life and marveled at how a single turn of events, something as seemingly benign as a neighbors' association meeting, could morph into such a dramatic coup. The memory always makes me smile. In hindsight, the actual day of Mom's triumph over Mr. M was less like a serious corporate takeover, and more like a well-scripted comedy, complete with jaw-dropping twists, conspiratorial whispers, and that satisfying final flourish. Mr. Min's defeat. Still, everything that led up to it and everything that happened afterward contained so many layers of frustration, humor, and even moments of sadness that I feel compelled to share the whole story in as much detail as I can. I lived in a set of 3 nearly identical 6-floor buildings. My mother and I resided on the 5th floor in Building 1. For the sake of clarity, let's call it that. Each building belonged to the same private company that managed all the major repairs and lease agreements. We weren't owners of our unit. Rather, we were long-term renters with a comfortable arrangement. But it often felt like we were the elders of the building, having lived there for years. Mom was already retired at this point, and because I was involved in local theater without a massive income, living with her made sense for us both. We kept each other company, saved on rent, and got along well. We also had our family dog, Mikak, an energetic, medium-sized mutt with a big heart. I'll forever cherish memories of Mike prancing around our living room, wagging his tail so hard that his entire back end shook. He'd been part of our household since he was a tiny puppy, and while Mom was definitely his favorite human, probably because she always slipped him little table scraps, he was my best buddy too. Unfortunately, not everyone adored Mike like we did. In particular, Mr. M, who lived directly below us on the 4th floor, had an endless list of grievances with almost everyone in the building. He especially liked to stir up trouble about Mike's occasional barking. To give you a sense of Mr. M's general demeanor, you can fill in whatever that MME in his name stands for. Personally, I considered him miserable old man, man-child, or simply menacing. I'm leaning toward man-child when recalling the tantrums he threw. From day one, Mr. M was that type of neighbor you'd catch complaining at 60A. If someone in the building dared to shuffle around too loudly. He lived alone with his wife, who ironically was far more patient and congenial than her husband. If a child cried in the hallway or a door closed too vigorously, he'd storm out into the corridor, his expression all thunder and doom, exclaiming that it was completely unacceptable. In fact, he once accused me of purposefully stomping down the stairs just because I happened to come home in heavier boots on a rainy day. Then there was his attitude toward friendliness. If you smiled and said hi, he'd glare at you suspiciously, as if you were up to some devious plan. If you didn't greet him at all, he would bristle with offense. The nerve of these youngsters. No respect. He wanted everything strictly on his terms, though I'm not sure there was a set of terms that would have pleased him. The dog barking complaints were perhaps the most consistent. Mick wasn't a frequent barker, nor was he so loud as to echo through the building, and we were scrupulous about controlling his noise, especially at night. But if Mike even gave one startled yip at a strange sound, Mr. M would promptly knock on our door, demanding we put that dog in its place. He'd always phrase it with contempt, as if Mike was launching some personal vendetta against him. The worst part was, pets were explicitly allowed in our building, and none of the other neighbors had any issues with him. My mother even went out of her way to ask people in the elevator or in the shared hallways, "Has Mike been bothering you?" She got a chorus of "not at all," or "he's so cute." Meanwhile, Mr. M would scowl and pretend to speak for everyone, complaining that the entire complex was apparently on the verge of collapse, thanks to a single bark. As if that weren't enough, Mr. M also happened to be a theater critic, a fact that intersected annoyingly with my own passion for local theater. I'm involved in a small but enthusiastic troupe, and we put on community plays a few times a year. They're never big productions, just local entertainment, but we took great pride in them. Over the years, we'd collected a modest set of reviews from local blogs and social media pages. Typically, we'd see encouraging feedback, especially from families or older folks who appreciated our comedic style, but there was always that one guy who'd write a scathing review, juvenile comedy, incompetent timing, an insult to the stage, or uninspired direction. A cast that lacks all manner of discipline. Guess who? That's right, Mr. M. Our neighbor from below never missed a chance to tear us down. I'd half expected him to show some neighborly courtesy and remain politely silent if he didn't like the show, but apparently not. He relished in his negativity. We learned all too soon that he was also the president of the Residents Association, commonly referred to as the Now I have to clarify. This wasn't an official, legally binding homeowners association. It was more of a group that managed shared resources and oversaw communal aspects of the complex. Yet the owners of the building gave them authority over petty but important aspects: the upkeep of the gardens, the usage and scheduling of the communal grill hut, and the planning of events in the shared laundry rooms, plus some access to a fund for minor but necessary purchases, like detergent supplies for the washing machines or furniture for the communal area. Mr. M ran that RA like his personal fiefdom. The group was small, just him, his wife, the designated secretary, though she struggled due to poor eyesight, and a handful of others who apparently were too apathetic to question his leadership. They mostly turned a blind eye to him because he bribed them with small perks, such as free theater tickets courtesy of his critic connections. It was a strategy that kept the rest of the RA docile. After all, if you're a big theater fan, free tickets might seem like a sweet deal, even if they come from the grumpiest man in the building. However, there was one bright spot in the RA besides Mr. A and his wife, Helen. Helen lived in Building 2 and had a child who was about 7 years old. She was the one who did most of the actual administrative tasks, like filing or scanning documents. If there was a conversation with the building owners about a budget item, she was the one who typed up the notes or typed up new guidelines. She did it quietly, behind the scenes, because the official secretary, M's wife, was not capable of fulfilling those tasks. She was an elderly woman who had vision problems and, from what I gleaned, no real interest in handling the grunt work. Meanwhile, my mother, with her background in business, secretarial tasks, and general no-nonsense competence, had struck up a friendship with Helen. Occasionally, Helen would come over to our apartment and sit down with a pile of paperwork. She'd ask Mom for advice on how to itemize certain expenses or how to write a formal note to the building owners about a planned maintenance. I'd be in another room, babysitting Helen's child or just listening from the kitchen, picking up bits and pieces of their conversations about Mr. M. They'd roll their eyes and exchange the latest bit of nonsense, he'd said in a meeting. My mother found his approach sloppy and unprofessional. She couldn't stand incompetent men in general, but incompetent men who lorded their tiny bit of power over everyone. That was like nails on a chalkboard to her. She often commented how these blowhards rule small domains because they'd never cut it in a professional environment. Things came to a head when Helen revealed that the annual R meeting was around the corner. It was an event held every year, open to all residents of the 3 buildings, so that everyone could voice concerns, make requests, or volunteer to become involved. Crucially, that same meeting was where the leadership of the RA was, theoretically, re-elected or reconfirmed. Except for years, that process had been a joke. Man's wife nominated him as president. No one else bothered to nominate anyone else, so he was acclaimed. Then, in turn, Mr. M would keep his wife as secretary. Their little cycle repeated itself, year after year, with zero challenge. Helen and my mother recognized that if Mr. M's status quo was to be broken, they'd need to do more than whisper behind his back. They needed a plan to dethrone him outright. Helen thought it might be possible, but was still hesitant. She doubted if anyone in the building cared enough to show up and participate in a coup. She worried that perhaps people would vote for him by default just because they didn't want to get involved in the RA drama. Mom, on the other hand, was confident in her ability to handle official matters. She was fed up with Mr. Ryan's sloppy record-keeping, manipulative tactics, and overall negativity. In short, they plotted to dethrone him. I didn't think Mom would get that invested. Typically, she was the sort of woman who minded her own business, especially in her retirement. But injustice and incompetence triggered something in her. Also, Mr. M's constant nagging about our dog, plus the negative reviews of my theater group, had sparked a certain righteous indignation in her. She didn't show it outwardly. She wasn't the type to engage in petty arguments, but behind the scenes she was meticulously planning how to execute a leadership shift. She discussed the plan with Helen in detail. The day, the annual RA meeting, would gather at least a modest crowd. People would show up either to complain about laundry machine schedules or bring up small maintenance requests. Typically, that's how Mr. M lured them in, ensuring the meeting was the only time they could request improvements or voice concerns in person. Then, after a token mention of items, he'd pass the rest of the year ignoring Themo. Mom also enlisted the help of one other RA member, someone who had a seat but rarely used it. She managed to convince them that it was time for real change and that my mother, with her administrative background and fairness, would be a better president. Possibly. Mr. M's wife was quietly on board too. She'd apparently confided that she was sick of being nominal secretary. She was done with the charade of signing documents she couldn't read. The day of the meeting arrived. I wasn't there because, quite frankly, the charade bored me to tears. I'd heard about the plan from Mom, but I didn't know precisely how it would unfold. All I knew was that she had a quiet confidence. It wasn't some dramatic vow like, "I'm going to take him down." Rather, it was a calm assurance. "He's been in that seat long enough. We'll see how he likes fair play." So the meeting commenced. True to form, Mr. M bellowed for order, introduced himself with a puffed chest, and quickly moved to the first item on the agenda, reassigning or reaffirming the roles for the next RA cycle. As usual, he expected his wife to pipe up with a nomination for him. He even gave her a pointed look, likely anticipating the script they had repeated year after year. But Helen beat her to the punch. She raised her hand and, right in front of everyone, nominated my mother for president. The room must have gone dead silent for a moment. People looked around as if to say, "Wait, we have another candidate." Mr. M's expression, I am told, was an absolute sight to behold. Like a cartoon character whose eyes popped out of their sockets, he demanded, in a slightly panicked voice, if there were any other nominations. He practically scanned the room, hoping someone else would speak up, but no one did. Some might have been stunned, while others were quietly thrilled to watch the meltdown. With no alternative, the group proceeded to vote. Mr. M's wife, of course, didn't nominate him. She stayed silent, which was perhaps her own subtle form of protest. And just like that, the A votes for Mom outnumbered any opposition. Actually, from what Mom told me, it was an almost unanimous voice vote. Apparently, no one wanted Mr. M continuing in the role. Mom was officially the new RA president. Then, to add the cherry on top, Helen took the secretary position. I remember the night Mom came home after that meeting. She walked in with a serene smile, carrying a folder of paperwork and wearing the expression of someone who'd won a quiet victory. When she explained how the nomination and vote happened, I laughed so hard I snorted. We both imagined Mr. M's face, first outraged, then panicked, and finally resigned. The next day, we learned how thoroughly unprepared he was for this eventuality. He sulked around the building, shooting Mom dirty looks whenever they passed each other in the hallway. Taking charge, Mom immediately dove into reorganizing the RA. She insisted on better bookkeeping. She pressed for transparency in how the communal funds were used. Gone were Mr. M's under-the-table expenses for theater outings with his buddies. Mom clarified to everyone that the building owners provided that money for the betterment of the entire community, not for personal entertainment. If there was going to be an event or purchase, it needed to be itemized, with receipts, so the owners saw where every penny went. The first official meeting under Mom's leadership took place about a week after she was elected. They met in a small communal office room near the lobby of Building 1. This time, Mr. M attended, presumably hoping he could browbeat or sabotage from within. But from what Mom recounted, he didn't last long. Within 20 minutes, he was fuming over some standard voting procedure that the group was using to allocate funds for new benches in the garden. Mom insisted on hearing from every building representative. Meanwhile, Mr. M wanted to override the discussion, claiming it was a waste of time. He started raising his voice, harping about how he used to manage everything in a fraction of that time, conveniently ignoring the fact that he managed it poorly. When it was clear Mom wouldn't let him bully the room, Mr. M slammed his hands on the table, called the entire proceeding ridiculous, and stormed out like a frustrated toddler. That was the last meeting he bothered attending. Apparently, losing the top seat meant he lost all interest in civic responsibility. After that, the newly restructured RA functioned more smoothly. People commented that they felt more comfortable voicing their requests because no one would jump down their throats. Over time, Mom's fairness and meticulous approach won her fans. Neighbors began stopping her in the lobby just to say, "Thank you for pushing through that hallway light repair," or "I really appreciate you not ignoring the laundry scheduling conflict." She wasn't overly lenient. If a neighbor had a frivolous complaint, she'd still handle it with a direct response. But she treated everyone equally, which was a stark contrast to Mr. M's favoritism. The building owners, too, took note of her leadership. They liked that she maintained clear documentation. She'd forward them monthly summaries of how the RA used the budget for maintenance or small improvements. Eventually, though, Life moved on for us. We didn't remain in the building forever. I continued with my theater endeavors and ended up traveling for some performances in nearby towns. Mom, too, found new interests in retirement and occasionally visited me backstage to lend moral support. But for a number of years, until we did leave that apartment, she dutifully served as RA president, ensuring no one else hijacked the role for personal gain. Even after we moved, neighbors would occasionally call or email her to ask for advice. We're about to plan the annual complex barbecue. Any tips for budgeting? Or, we had a plumbing issue in Building 3. What's the best approach with the owners? She would always respond graciously, giving them a template for letters or directing them to the correct contact. Her sense of responsibility extended beyond her immediate obligations. She didn't shrug them off simply because she was no longer living there. Sadly, Mom passed away 2 months ago, and I'm still grappling with that loss every day. She was so integral to my life, my confidante, my occasional partner in comedic mischief, and my wise mentor. The memory of that ragu is one of the many stories that keep her spirit alive for me. I wish I could sit down with her again, hearing her describe how Mr. N's expression changed that day, or how she meticulously reorganized the RA files in alphabetical order. She was never a woman who sought the limelight for the sake of ego. Rather, she cared about doing things right and believed in treating people fairly. One small silver lining, if you can call it that, is that Mr. N passed away earlier this summer, before she did. While I would never wish harm on him, I do find a certain poetic justice in the fact that Mom spent her last years free of his nagging. Maybe it's a petty thought, but there it is. Looking back, there are a few important lessons I took from that entire saga. Leadership can absolutely corrupt if there's no oversight. Mr. M had grown used to an unchecked environment. He never faced opposition, so he settled into a pattern of entitlement. He used communal funds for personal benefits, told neighbors they had no right to question him, and made decisions that suited his personal tastes. In that type of environment, one can start seeing themselves as a king among peasants. People often don't challenge authority until someone else lights the spark. Helen, for all her grievances, struggled to challenge Mr. M alone. She was dealing with her child, and raw duties were a burden on top of her normal life. She might have dreamed of overthrowing him, but she didn't have the energy or a partner to coordinate with. Mom was that partner, someone with the skill and willpower to step in. Once Mom stepped up, it was as though the entire building realized, wait, we can do something about this, and a wave of support materialized almost instantly. Competence and fairness matter more than people realize. Once Mom was in charge, the RAI functioned more effectively, and people appreciated IT. The owners, who were used to half-baked reports and sloppy finances, suddenly had well-structured documents that they could easily scan and approve. Neighbors' concerns were heard in open discussions, not summarily dismissed. That sense of, hey, my voice matters here, improved the community atmosphere. It's never too late to stand up to bullies. Some folks in the building had resigned themselves to Mr. M's tyranny for years. They decided it was too much of a hassle to fight back, but in the end it took one well-orchestrated nomination, one challenge to the usual procedure, to topple him. That's a potent reminder that even small acts of defiance can ripple out into big changes. You can be kind and still be firm. My mother was never malicious or overly personal in her approach to Mr. N. She didn't go around insulting his intelligence or mocking him. Privately, we'd call him man-child, sure, but that was more comedic venting than a public stance. Instead, she stuck to the facts. The building deserved better management. The records were disorganized. The funds were misused. And if no one else wanted to fix it, she would bunny. That was the basis of her leadership style, a balance of warmth and no-nonsense practicality. I've also thought a lot about my dog, Mike, in this context. He passed away a few years before Mom did, and I often wonder what he'd make of all this if he had a doggy understanding of politics. Probably he wouldn't care. He'd just be happy not to have Mr. N scolding him for barking. Yet, in some ways, Mr. N's incessant complaints about our dog was the catalyst that solidified our determination. If he hadn't harassed us so much, maybe we would have kept ignoring his antics. When he started messing with our beloved pup, well, that was a step too far. One of my favorite memories from that period was the morning after Mom's successful coup. Helen came over for coffee. Mom set out a tray of pastries, chocolate croissants, mini donuts, and some fruit. The two of them chatted, half laughing in relief and half venting about all the neglected tasks they'd have to catch up on. Helen was astounded that Mr. Sm's meltdown had occurred so quietly, like he literally had no supporters. There had been no drama from the other residents, no attempt to defend him. Apparently, everyone was just tired of his negativity, but it took a strong figure like Mom to galvanize them. Helen said she planned on reforming the sign-up system for the grill hut, since Mr. M used to lend the key out arbitrarily or keep it for himself. In the new plan, a resident could simply sign up on a shared sheet in the lobby, get the code from the RA, and have an allotted time to use the hut. Transparent, fair, and easy. Then, they'd add a deposit system if you needed to borrow the big grill implements, so if anything got damaged, the RA could replace it. Mom thought that was a fantastic idea and added it to the agenda for the next meeting. There was also the matter of the gardens. Mr. M had refused certain low-cost proposals to plant more flowers or add a bench near the playground, presumably because it wasn't a priority. In reality, he just didn't want to deal with it. Mom and Helen quickly budgeted for it out of the raw funds and put it to a vote, which passed easily. Within a month, we had a new bench under a flowering tree, and I'd see seniors from the building happily sitting there in the afternoon sun. Small changes, sure, but ones that improved day-to-day life for everyone. I found it funny that Mr. Bruck and his wife, after years of playing the role of the bored, legally blind secretary, actually looked more relaxed once the new system was in place. She would meet Mom in the hallway and actually smile or say hello in a friendly tone. Very different from Mr. M's permanent scowl. Mom asked her once if she needed a new role in the RA, something she could handle more comfortably. The poor woman politely declined, but thanked Mom, adding that she was relieved not to be forced into the old pattern. She was not, however, bold enough to stand up to her husband, so for years she'd sat in that seat quietly. Another lesson there, I suppose. Sometimes people go along with rotten systems out of fear or weariness. The owners of the building were also impressed by the switch. Mom was the type to send them monthly bullet point updates. We replaced the broken lounge chairs by the playground. The cost was X. We're scheduling a painting of the stairwell in Building 3. Estimated cost Y. Vendor quotes attached. Crisp. Straightforward with no nonsense. They wrote back that they appreciated her approach. They even shared a bit about how they'd always suspected Mr. M wasn't the best manager but didn't want to override the residents' choice. They were thankful someone else stepped up to handle the role. Mom's presidency carried on without too many major incidents. Occasionally Mr. M would still pass by in a huff, muttering under his breath. If he spotted my mother, he'd glare, like a dethroned king bristling at the new regime. But there was little he could do. He wasn't a major shareholder or anything. He was just one resident among many. He could complain, but that didn't carry much weight anymore now that he wasn't in the leadership circle. And so, effectively, that's how one of the most dramatic neighborhood coups I've witnessed transpired. I stayed on the sidelines, gleaning the details through Mom's nightly reports and Helen's occasional visits. Over time, it became a story we'd chuckle about over dinner, or whenever a neighbor asked, "How did you manage to finally get rid of Mr. M?" After all these years, I've taken that memory to heart. In any communal environment, be it an apartment complex, a condo, or a co-op, there will always be a risk that someone like Mr. M rises to the top. Often the rest of us are too busy or too indifferent to contest it. People grumble but do nothing. It takes an instigator, a calm yet determined figure, who can say, "We deserve better," to shift the dynamics. And if you can find even a small group of allies, that's often enough to dethrone a petty tyrant. I'm sure if Mom were around today, she'd have plenty more stories of the mishaps that Mr. M's mismanagement caused. Possibly she'd tell them with a wry grin, mocking his self-important stance. My mother always had a gift for comedic timing in her redelings. Maybe that's where I got my love for theater. In her final years, she'd occasionally mention how proud she was that she took a stand. It was never about self-aggrandizement. It was about showing people there could be a better way to handle communal affairs, with clarity and integrity. As for me, I still think about that short, balding figure of Mr. M waddling down the corridor, complaining about some non-existent noise or drama, trying to maintain a semblance of authority. Despite the annoyance he caused in a strange way, I'm thankful for him. Had he not been so overbearing, my mother might never have been inspired to bring her organizational prowess to the RA. She wouldn't have left that legacy of improved community engagement. Sometimes adversity lights the fuse of positive change, even if that adversity comes in the form of an overbearing neighbor. In the end, Mom outlived Mr. M, though not by very long. There's a certain bittersweetness to that fact. It seems she got the last word, the last laugh, and the final victory. The building enjoyed her leadership, and after we moved, the new set of our leaders continued her policies. By the time she passed, I was bombarded with messages from old neighbors. They shared how she'd influenced them, how her management style had positively shaped the community. It all reinforced something I'd always known. My mother was a remarkable woman who never shied away from doing what she believed was right. In my private moments, I sometimes talked to her spirit, or at least the memory of her, telling her about the new plays our theater group is putting on. I imagine her rolling her eyes at Mr. P's ghostly scowls, telling him to hush up because her kid is putting on a performance, and if he doesn't like it, he can find another building to haunt. I picture Mike bounding around in some doggy afterlife, ignoring all of Mr. P's rants, and I laugh, because it's so fitting that the scenario closes with Mom in triumph, Mr. M dethroned, and our family, plus many neighbors, breathing freely again. Ultimately, the moral of this whole story is threefold. First, tyranny can exist at even the smallest level, like a local residents' association, and we should never underestimate how it can fester if left unchecked. Second, it only takes one or two determined individuals to rally a community, proving that there's power in well-organized unity. Third, and perhaps most importantly, we should always remember that life is short, so we might as well stand up for ourselves and our neighbors when faced with petty bullies. My mother did exactly that, turning something as dull-sounding as an annual meeting into a moment of absolute poetic justice. I hope this retelling keeps her spirit alive in some small way, celebrating the no-nonsense, formidable woman she was. She remains my hero, long after she's gone. Every time I climb a flight of stairs, I can almost hear her telling me, "Don't let people like Mr. M walk all over you. Speak up, set things right, and if my local theater group ever invites a critic for a show, I'll remember Mr. M's sour faces, and I'll beam with pride because if we stood up to him once, we can stand up to anyone."